The majority of Ecuadorians trace their origins to one or more of three geographical sources of human migrations: the pre-Hispanic indigenous populations who settled the region over 15,000 years ago, the Europeans who arrived over 5 centuries ago, and ultimately the black sub-Saharan Africans whom they imported as slave labor during the same period. The mixing of two or more of these three groups established other mixed ethnic groups. Mestizos, the multiracial group of mixed European and Amerindian ancestry, are by far the largest of all the ethnic groups and comprise around 71.9% of the current population. Whites are estimated at 6.1% and consist largely of those of unmixed or predominant European descent. Most white Ecuadorians are of colonial-era Spanish origin, also known as Criollos and Zambos. Population census data. The Ecuadorian census is conducted by the governmental institution known as INEC, Instituto Nacional de Estadísticas y Censos. The census in Ecuador is conducted every 10 years, and its objective is to obtain the number of people residing within its borders. The current census now includes household information. The most recent census emphasized reaching rural and remote areas to map the most accurate population count in the country. The 2010 census was conducted in November and December, and its results were published the 27th of January 2011. The following table shows the dates the most recent censuses were made, and the total population number, index of growth, UN estimates. According to the 2015 revision of the World Population Prospects, the total population was 16,144,000 in 2015, compared to only 3,470,000 in 1950. The proportion of children below the age of 15 in 2015 was 29.0%, 63.4% was between 15 and 65 years of age, while 6.7% was 65 years or older. Structure of the population. Vital statistics. Registration of vital events is in Ecuador not complete. The Population Department of the United Nations prepared the following estimates: births and deaths, CIA World Fact Book. Demographic statistics. The following demographic statistics are from the CIA World Fact Book, unless otherwise indicated. Population 15,007,343. Median age total 25.7 years. Male 25 years. Female 26.3 years. Population growth rate 1.443%. Net migration rate -0.52 migrant 1,000. Population -0.81 migrant 1,000. Population sex ratio at birth 1.05 male female under 15 years, 1.04 male female 15 to 64 years, 0.97 male female 65 years and over, 0.93 male female. Total population 0.99 male female. HIV/AIDS adult prevalence rate 0.3%. HIV/AIDS people living with HIV/AIDS 26,000. HIV/AIDS deaths 1,400. Nationality noun Ecuadorian. Adjective Ecuadorian religions: Roman Catholic approximately 95%, Protestant approximately 4%, Jewish below 0.002%, Eastern Orthodox under 0.2%, Muslim approximately 0.001%, Buddhism under 0.15%, Animism beliefs under 0.5%, Atheist and agnostics 1%. Languages: Spanish, Amerindian languages. Achua-Chihuahua 2000. Pastaza province. Alternate names: Achua, Achul, Achuara, Achuale. Chachi 3450 Esmeraldas Province, Cayapas River System. Alternate names: Cayapa, Chapalachi, Colorado 2300 Santo Domingo de los Colorados Province. Alternate names: Sashila, Sufiki, Quechua. 9 separate dialects are spoken in as many areas in the country with a combined population of 1,460,000. Schwa 46,669, Morona, Santiago Province. Alternate names: Jivaro, Zivaro, Jibaro, Chihuaro, Shuara. Wayorani 1,650. Napo and Morona, Santiago Provinces. Alternate names: Wayuarani, Wayuodani, Huao. Literacy definition: age 15 and over, can read and write. Total population: 91%, male 92.3%, female 89.7%. Geography: due to the prevalence of malaria and yellow fever in the coastal region until the end of the 19th century, the Ecuadorian population was most heavily concentrated in the highlands and valleys of the Sierra region. Today's population is distributed more evenly between the Sierra and the Costa region. Migration towards the cities, particularly larger cities, in all regions has increased the urban population to about 55%. The Oriente region, consisting of Amazonian lowlands to the east of the Andes and covering about half the country's land area, remains sparsely populated and contains only about 3% of the country's population. For the most are indigenous peoples who maintain a wary distance from the recent mestizo and white settlers. The territories of the Oriente are home to as many as 9 indigenous groups: Quechua, Achua, Wayuarani, Siona, Sequoia, Shiwiya, and Kofan, all represented politically by the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of the Ecuadorian Amazon, CONFENIE. As a result of the oil exploration and the development of the infrastructure required for the exploitation of the oil fields in the eastern jungles, during the 70s and early 80s, there was a wave of settlement in the region. The majority of these wave of internal immigration came from the southern province of Loya as a result of a drought that lasted 3 years and affected the southern provinces of the country. This boom of the petroleum industry has led to a mushrooming of the town of Lago Agrio, as well as substantial deforestation and pollution of wetlands and lakes. Nationality, ethnicity, and race. There are 5 major ethnic groups in Ecuador: Mestizo, White, Afro-Ecuadorian, Amerindian, and Montevideo. Mestizos constitute more than 70% of the population. Ecuador's population descends from Spanish immigrants and indigenous South American Indians, admixed with descendants of black slaves who arrived to work on coastal plantations in the 16th century. The mix of these groups is described as mestizo cholo. Censuses do not record ethnic affiliation, which in any event remains fluid. Thus, estimates of the numbers of each group should be taken only as approximations. In the 1980s, Indians and mestizos represented the bulk of the population, with each group accounting for roughly 40% of total population. Whites represented 10 to 15% and blacks the remaining 5%. According to Clark, writing in 1989, ethnic groups in Ecuador have had a traditional hierarchy of white, mestizo, blacks, and then others. Her review depicts this hierarchy as a consequence of colonial attitudes and of the terminology of colonial legal distinctions. Spanish-born persons residing in the New World were at the top of the social hierarchy, followed by criollos, born of 2 Spanish parents in the colonies. The 19th century usage of mestizo was to denote a person whose parents were an Indian and a white, a Cholo had one Indian and one Mestizo parent. By the 20th century, Mestizo and Cholo were frequently used interchangeably. Clark suggested that societal relationships, occupation, manners, and clothing all derived from ethnic affiliation. Nonetheless, according to Clark, individuals could potentially switch ethnic affiliation if they had culturally adapted to the recipient group. Such switches were made without resort to subterfuge. Moreover, the precise criteria for defining ethnic groups varies considerably. The vocabulary that more prosperous mestizos and whites used in describing ethnic groups mixes social and biological characteristics. Ethnic affiliation thus is dynamic. Indians often become mestizos, and prosperous mestizos seek to improve their status sufficiently to be considered whites. Ethnic identity reflects numerous characteristics, only one of which is physical appearance. Others include dress, language, community membership, and self-identification. A geography of ethnicity remained well defined until the surge in migration that began in the 1950s. Whites resided primarily in larger cities. Mestizos lived in small towns scattered throughout the countryside. Indians formed the bulk of the Sierra rural populace, although mestizos filled this role in the areas with few Indians. Most blacks lived in Esmeraldas province, with small enclaves found in the Carchi and Imbabura provinces. Pressure on Sierra land resources and the dissolution of the traditional hacienda, however, increased the numbers of Indians migrating to the Costa, the Oriente, and the cities. By the 1980s, Sierra Indians, or Indians in the process of switching their ethnic identity to that of mestizos, lived on Costa plantations in Quito, Guayaquil, and other cities, and in colonization areas in the Oriente and the Costa. Indeed, Sierra Indians residing in the coastal region substantially outnumbered the remaining original Costa inhabitants, the Cayapa and Colorado Indians. In the late 1980s, analysts estimated that there were only about 4,000 Cayapas and Colorados. Some blacks had migrated from the remote region of the Ecuadorian-Colombian border to the towns and cities of Esmeraldas. Afro-Ecuadorians are an ethnic group in Ecuador who are descendants of black African slaves brought by the Spanish during their conquest of Ecuador from the Incas. They make up from 3% to 5% of Ecuador's population. Ecuador has a population of about 1,120,000 descendants from African people. The Afro-Ecuadorian culture is found primarily in the country's northwest coastal region. Africans form a majority in the province of Esmeraldas and also have an important concentration in the Valle del Chota in the Imbabura province. They can be also found in important numbers in Quito and Guayaquil. Indigenous Sierra Indians had an estimated population of 1.5 to 2 million in the early 1980s and live in the intermontane valleys of the Andes. Prolonged contact with Hispanic culture, which dates back to the conquest, has had a homogenizing effect, reducing the variation among the indigenous Sierra tribes. The Indians of the Sierra are separated from whites and mestizos by Castalic Gulf. They are marked as a disadvantaged group. To be an Indian or indigena in Ecuador is to be stigmatized. Indians are usually poor and frequently illiterate. They enjoy limited participation in national institutions, and they command access to fewer of the social and economic opportunities available to more privileged groups. Visible markers of ethnic affiliation, especially hairstyle, dress, and language, separate Indians from the rest of the populace. Indians wore more manufactured items by the late 1970s than previously. Their clothing, nonetheless, was distinct from that of other rural inhabitants. Indians in communities relying extensively on wage labor sometimes assumed Western-style dress while still maintaining their Indian identity. Indians speak Quechua, a Quechua dialect, although most are bilingual. Speaking Spanish is a second language with varying degrees of facility. By the late 1980s, some younger Indians no longer learned Quechua. Oriente Indians, although the Indians of the Oriente first came into contact with whites in the 16th century, the encounters were more sporadic than those of most of the country's indigenous population. Until the 19th century, most non-Indians entering the region were either traders or missionaries. Beginning in the 1950s, however, the government built roads and encouraged settlers from the Sierra to colonize the Amazon River basin. Virtually all remaining Indians were brought into increasing contact with national society. The interaction between Indians and outsiders had a profound impact on the indigenous way of life. In the late 1970s, roughly 30,000 Quechua speakers and 15,000 Jaivaros lived in Oriente Indian communities. Quechua speakers grew out of the detribalization of members of many different groups after the Spanish conquest, subject to the influence of Quechua-speaking missionaries and traders. Various elements of the Yumbos adopted the tongue as a lingua franca and gradually lost the previous languages and tribal origins. Yumbos were scattered throughout the Oriente, whereas the Jaivaros, subdivided into the Shuar and the Achua, were concentrated in southeastern Ecuador. Some also lived in northeastern Peru. Traditionally, both groups relied on migration to resolve intra-community conflict and to limit the ecological damage to the tropical forest caused by slash-and-burn agriculture. Both the Yumbos and the Jaivaros depended on agriculture as the primary means of subsistence. Manioc, the main staple, was grown in conjunction with a wide variety of other fruits and vegetables. Yumbo men also resorted to wage labor to obtain cash for the few purchases deemed necessary. By the mid-1970s, increasing numbers of Quechua speakers settled around some of the towns and missions of the Oriente. Indians themselves had begun to make a distinction between Christian and jungle Indians. The former engaged in trade with townspeople. The Jaivaros, in contrast to the Christian Quechua speakers, lived in more remote areas. The mode of horticulture was similar to that of the non-Christian Yumbos, although they supplemented crop production with hunting and some livestock raising. Shamans played a pivotal role in social relations in both groups. As the main leaders and the focus of local conflicts, shamans were believed to both cure and kill through magical means. In the 1980s, group conflicts between rival shamans still erupted into full-scale feuds with loss of life. The Oriente Indian population dropped precipitously during the initial period of intensive contact with outsiders. The destruction of the crops by Mestizos laying claim to indigenous lands, the rapid exposure to diseases to which Indians lacked immunity, and the extreme social disorganization all contributed to increased mortality and decreased birth rates. One study of the Shuar in the 1950s found that the group between 10 and 19 years of age was smaller than expected. This was the group that had been youngest and most vulnerable during the initial contact with national society. Normal population growth rates began to re-establish themselves after approximately the first decade of such contact.